In the noon heat of a Nile summer, the courtyard stones shimmered with dust and incense smoke, the sun throwing narrow bands of light between painted columns. A young woman stood barefoot on warmed limestone, her hair bound and braided, fingers white around a small clay amulet. Voices came from the inner hall in low, practiced cadence, the rustle of linen and the metallic ring of a key on a belt. Her father watched from the gate, hands empty of grain and full of apology. When the matron reached for the braid and cut it with a dull bronze blade, the sound was a soft finality, like a string breaking. What they call consecration, the city registers call transfer of ownership. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications. Your support helps us bring you fascinating stories every single day. Now, let's get into the ending of this captivating story. This is not myth. Papyri, temple inventories, and administrative lists survive. Permissions, receipts, and letters show a legal architecture built around devotion and possession. If you want to see what official praise concealed behind stone reliefs and guided tours, listen closely. The documents and the traces in the ground tell a different story, and it is darker than the gilded images suggest. The institution at the center of this story was more than a place of worship. The temple served as a bank, a granary, a judge, and a landlord. Taxes and offerings flowed into its storehouses and out through ledgers that recorded names as if they were units of value. Fields were leased in the temple name. Tributes were converted into labor. Families who could not meet levies handed over daughters as a way to cancel debt and preserve land. Officials recorded transfers with the same routine as grain receipts. The temple steward Hapu kept lists in an ordered hand. The scribe Amen recorded titles, and the high official Anen signed documents that turned people into entries. Archaeological surveys show storerooms labeled with the same names later found in inventories of people. Travelers' accounts, administrative ledgers, and fragments of correspondence corroborate that dedication could mean either honor or legal dispossession. The claim that these dedications were purely voluntary offerings of piety collapses when we compare donation formulas to debt claims and to court rulings that expressly note coercion. We need to be precise about terms. When the sources speak of conscription as a vow or as consecration, they meant different things depending on context. The word translated as virgin in many guides often functioned as a legal category, more than a condition of age or sexual status. A devotee or servant of the god could be consigned as a perpetual attendant, registered as a cultic laborer, and entered into inventories as a temple asset. Renaming was not symbolic alone. It was administrative. Purification could be a ritual bath or a medical inspection recorded by a temple physician. The phrase consignment, a priest in a mask intoned a litany while an attendant read aloud from a roll that effectively registered the woman as property to be used in specific temple tasks. In a ritual scene, we can imagine a matron, Becket, saying, "This is now for the house of the god," Neferet answering, "I will obey," the priest Anen reciting the formula, and the scribe Amenhat scratching symbols into a wax tablet. Sensory details are loud here. The scrape of razor on scalp, the dry crack of hair on stone, the smell of burned resin, the cool pressure of stone underfoot, and the taste of salt from tears. The ritual language insisted on sanctity, yet the administrative margin notes alongside the ritual text show conditions, allowances, and penalties. The same papyrus that preserved the consecration formula also contains a ledger entry detailing rations and a clause about punishment for disobedience. Life in the precinct tightened into routine. Dormitory slabs were lit at first light and swept by young hands. Work schedules posted on wooden slates. Silence enforced by an overseer whose name appears in several lists. Maru oversaw spinning and weaving. Hapu allocated grain. Iri kept the keys. Becket taught prayers, and Rahotep recorded infractions. The soundscape included the clack of loom, the low hum of prayers, the scrape of a reed stylus on papyrus, the creak of sandals on stone, and the distant river traffic. At night, the women stitched cloth that bore coded mistakes as acts of resistance, a deliberate dropped thread here, a mismatched dye there. Friendships formed in whispered exchanges. In a dormitory scene, two women spoke in hushed cadence. Neferet said, "My hands remember the field," and Merit answered, "Your fingers will remember the loom, but do not forget the sun." And Siptah, who had been assigned to mend torches, murmured, "We will memorize each other." And Beckett warned, "Silence preserves you," while Maru cautioned, "Names are dangerous." These conversations repeated in variations and extended into an intricate network. A midwife named Aset, a novice called Kia, a recorder named Amenemhat, and a traveler who later wrote of them called Nefru. Punishments were public and precise. The record shows fines deducted from rations for infractions, and a handful of examples where women were exiled to a desert outpost, left without legal name or support. Memory of those punishments survived in graffiti scratched on storeroom walls, in terse notes by scribes, and in the way the census lists suddenly stopped including certain names. The most grave abuses happened under the cover of sanctity. At the center of the precinct was a chamber where a ceremony of claim and display took place. A priest, masked and robed, stood in the place of the god. He was named Anen in the accounts, and his authority came with legal instruments. The ceremony was phrased as a union of deity and devotee, and the language in the liturgy is layered with metaphors of binding and nourishment. In the ledger, there are entries that record births and the allocation of children to temple households. A pregnancy recorded in the margin of an inventory resigned the mother to a different status and the child to a separate register. Conversations from the inner circle are preserved as directives. Amen, the scribe, would note, "Make note of offspring," and Beckett would reply, "Their maintenance from the temple storehouse is recorded," and Hapu would assert, "These entries are legal and not optional," and Maru would instruct, "The mother will remain under supervision." The tension builds in these scenes. The hush when the priest removes his mask, the muffled sob behind a curtain, the scent of oil and the metallic tang of fear. Moments of confrontation occurred with small acts that escalated. In one tense episode, Neferet refused to accept the renaming and slapped a matron. The guard Eri stepped forward, and the matron Beckett commanded, "Restraint is for your good." Neferet spat, "I have a name," and the scribe Amen wrote it down anyway. That refusal rippled. The record shows the immediate consequences and the formal note of punishment that followed. There were at least 4 recorded moments when the pressure snapped and a new course was forced by resistance or a scandal. The first moment involved a hidden note found sewn into a band of cloth that read, "I remember my brother," and a list of names. And it circulated among the dormitories until a gatekeeper discovered it. The second moment was a midwife Aset who secretly taught some women to read margin notes so they could find their names in the archives. The third was a scribe Amenemhat who mistakenly left an inventory exposed to a visiting merchant who later smuggled fragments to a letter writer in the Delta, and the information spread. The fourth was an open confrontation when a young woman named Merit ran into the market and shouted the ledger numbers to passers-by until soldiers were called. Each of these incidents is compressed into administrative replies. Fines recalculated, guards reassigned, punitive transfers to frontier granaries. The archival traces of these moments are sharp, and they show how the institution responded. Faster locking, more careful inventories, harsher penalties, and, in a few cases, the erasure of certain names. These episodes reveal both the fragility and the reach of the system, and show how small acts of memory could be both dangerous and powerful. Resistance took many forms besides overt protest. Women embedded mistakes in their weaving, scratched names on storage jars, and passed fragments of letters to sympathetic scribes. A midwife hid a child in a linen bundle, and a traveler Nefru later described a woman who slipped out at night to stand by the river and whisper names until the stars seemed to answer. Papyri from the temple archive show margins rubbed as if by intentional erasure and a series of corrections that read like attempts to hide prior entries. Punishments ranged from extra rations withheld to exile to remote labor camps. Posts beyond the desert where survival was precarious. Some were recorded as deserters and left with no legal claim. Tomb inscriptions sometimes omit lineage where there had been one before. There are burial sites with anonymous graves near temple precincts and funerary offerings that bear no personal names. At the same time, there are testimonies in later outsider accounts that record carved graffiti and a shard with a name scrawled by a woman away from official lists. These traces matter because they show both the system and the fissures within it. 1 month after a public incident in the courtyard, the temple administration tightened controls. Registers list additional guards, rations were recalculated, and Beckett issued a memo that required daily roll calls. Friend networks shifted, letters were intercepted, the atmosphere grew colder. The matron enforced curfews, and the loom schedules were rearranged so weaving work stretched into later hours, fracturing the opportunities for conversation. A scribe named Amenemhat documented each night watch, and the margin notes sigh with wear. A month later, the community outside the precinct had begun to speak differently about the temple. Merchants who once traded freely adopted a wary tone, and travelers altered routes. The ledger entries show a slight drop in offerings and a parallel increase in fines and loans given in exchange for temporary relief, suggesting families were under pressure to placate the institution or to hold on to land. 3 months after the first public uproar, the legal apparatus had moved to formalize many practices that had been informal. Copies of statutes recorded new clauses concerning dedications as debt payments and defined the rights of the temple over offspring born within its walls. The list of designated overseers expanded, and a new office appeared to manage inscriptions and to vet donations. Some sympathetic scribes lost positions. A few names disappeared from the register altogether as their families negotiated transfers with frontiersmen or sold plots to new owners. In the populous docks, the rumor mill hardened into accusation, and pamphlets of complaint, not unlike the marginal letters found later in archives, began to circulate among traders and wandering literate men. A growing number of marginal notes express unease, and in a few cases, explicit challenge to the idea that consecration equaled honor. If you've made it this far, don't forget to hit the like button and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. 6 months later, the longer consequences were visible. Some women had been reassigned to work in estate houses far from the sanctuaries. A handful of names appear again as freed persons in outlying records, suggesting negotiation or intervention by outsiders. The archaeological record shows amendments to accounting practices and a proliferation of small graffiti memorials outside the precincts. An excavation would later find a clay shard with a name and a short scratch reading, "Remember," written in hurried signs. Scholars who examined the register pages centuries later found layers of correction and erasure and used paleographic techniques to reconstruct. A trace of original entries. The story left a mixed legacy: legal codification that endured, but also persistent, scattered acts of remembrance that kept personal identities alive in hidden places. At the end, when the precinct doors closed on those who had been listed as devotees, the stone did not simply cover bodies. It covered names, pedigrees, and the possibility of ordinary lives recognized beyond the precinct. The papyri and the ledgers we have examined show a system that mixed religious language with legal instruments to produce social control. Yet the margins of those same documents reveal resistance, a seam of deliberate error in a weaving, a scratched name on a jar, an escaped note sewn into cloth. Those traces prove 2 things: that the practice was systematic and that memory persisted. To remember these women is to reframe our understanding of how power used sanctity as a mechanism of property and coercion. If this episode moved you, share it and subscribe. When you subscribe, we will dive further into archives, consult specialists who can read the fated hands on these rolls, and bring more of these voices into the light. The stones and the papyri remember. It is our responsibility to listen.